Good morning. Thank you for being here. We're thrilled that you're here. We're excited for this time to one another, to encourage one another, to exhort one another, to teach one another, and it's awesome that we get to do that Christ created this family. Speaking of family, my wonderful sister-in-law and my brother are here. I don't know, it kind of makes me emotional. I look up to my brother so much. I remember just walking by. We'd read our Bibles on our own, through the day, and I'd read a chapter and be like, oh, I did it. And I'd walk by and I'd see him just studying for hours. I'd be like, oh, I'd feel guilty, and then I'd run back and start reading more. So it's always been kind of set the bar spiritually for me. That's just a wonderful blessing. If you wanted to get to know about someone, one way you can do it is by hearing what they say or reading what they write, right? You can get an idea of a person based on what they say, but what's another way you can learn about somebody? You can learn about someone based on how they act or how they react in certain situations. And congratulations, you just learned what theology is. Theology is getting to know the nature of God through either what he said, but also through what he does. Through his words, through how he behaves, how he reacts, we can get a picture of who the God is that we serve. What is his view towards things. We can get a picture based on these things. And Paul writes in Romans 15, he says, "For whatever was written in the former days was written for our instruction, that through endurance and through the encouragement of the scriptures, we might have hope." So does he say only certain books of the Old Testament are good for instruction? No, whatever was written in there, it's there for a reason. And it can give us instruction through endurance and through encouragement. So we're going to use the Old Testament today, and we're going to learn about the God we serve through how he acted in two different stories, in two different accounts. The first one is Levitical lawlessness, Leviticus 10. I love alliteration, but it comes back to bite me sometimes. I'm actually up here while I'm typing it. I'm like, oh, yeah, that's great. And then I say it and botch it, whatever. All right, so the context here in Leviticus chapter 10. So God has brought Israel out of Egyptian slavery into the wilderness and commissioned a place of presence with his people, also called the tabernacle, very good, or tent of meeting. And God had chosen Aaron and his descendants to be the mediators between God and the people. Aaron's descendants, his children, and Aaron himself were priests. They conducted the sacrifices, and it was a very sacred and holy role. So chapters 1 through 6, there's this summary given in chapter 7 of all the previous chapters leading up to it. It says, "This is the law of the burnt offering, of the grain offering, sin offering, guilt offering, ordination offering, and the peace offering," all things in the previous chapters, "which the Lord commanded Moses on Mount Sinai, on the day that he commanded the people of Israel to bring their offerings to the Lord in the wilderness of Sinai." And so God gives all these instructions. They kind of repeat there. And then in chapter 8, God gives a grave warning, a deadly warning. He says in verse 34, "As has been done today, the Lord has commanded to be done to make atonement for you. At the entrance of the tent of meeting, you shall remain," this is to the priest, "you shall remain day and night for 7 days, performing what the Lord has charged you." Why? "So that you may not die, for so I have been commanded." And Aaron and his sons did all the things that the Lord commanded by Moses. So you have the creator of heaven and earth, the God of the universe, that says, "Build me a house so I can dwell with my people." So what does God want? He wants presence with his people. But there's an important thing to understand. God's presence is dangerous because I read one author described it this way. God is like a nuclear reactor, right? It conducts the power of the whole universe. It keeps lights on. It keeps everything going. But what happens if you just walk in carelessly into a nuclear reactor or don't act carefully around that? It's dangerous, right? Because God is powerful. So he's given them fair warning, in other words. And then in chapter 9, we see a fiery theophany. Theophany is a fancy word that just means a physical way that God manifests himself. That God appears in some tangible or physical way or through vision. That's a theophany, God revealing himself. So in chapter 9, in verse 3, it says, "And say to the people of Israel, take a male goat for a sin offering and a calf and a lamb, both a year old without blemish for a burnt offering, and an ox and a ram for peace offerings to sacrifice before the Lord, and a grain offering mixed with oil. For today the Lord will appear to you." And Moses said, "This is the thing that the Lord commanded you to do, that the glory of the Lord may appear to you." So he says, hey, get the sacrifices in order, get everything going, and God's going to reveal himself. You'll see the glory of the Lord. And how do they see the glory of the Lord? Fast forward to verse 23. And Moses and Aaron went into the tent of meeting, and when they came out, they blessed the people, and the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people. And what happened? And fire came out from before the Lord and consumed the burnt offering and the pieces of fat on the altar. And when all the people saw it, they shouted and fell on their faces. Yeah, I bet so. But think about, where did this fire, where was it? It was at the altar, right? So God reveals himself through this fire at the altar. So God has been thorough in how he was to be approached and precise in what rituals to observe. This shows us something, that God desired to be with his people, but his presence requires obedience and holiness because God is holy. So that was just the previous chapter. God reveals himself through this fire, and that fire is at the altar. But notice what it says, chapter 10, verse 1. Immediately, it's like following this, so that happens. Then chapter 10, verse 1. Now Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, each took his censer, and what did they do? They put fire in it and laid incense on it and offered unauthorized fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. And fire came out from before the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. And if you drop down to verse 6, it says, And Moses said to Aaron and to Eleazar and Ithamar his sons, Do not let the hair of your heads hang loose, and do not tear your clothes, lest you die. So in other words, like, you're still on priestly service right now. It doesn't stop just because of what happened. You're still on duty. And wrath come upon all the congregation, but let your brothers, the whole house of Israel, bewail the burning that the Lord has kindled. They brought a fire, God brought a fire. See that? God started a fire. And do not go outside the entrance of the tent of meeting, lest you die, for the anointing oil of the Lord is upon you. And they did according to the word of Moses. So the priests were there as mediators of God's presence to the people. We understand that. They stood between heaven and earth, in other words. And their job was very important because it wasn't just them. Guess who else relied on the priests? All the Israelites, all the other tribes. So yes, this undoubtedly was a personal tragedy for Aaron, but he says, hey, you're still on duty. And all the people matter right now. You're still on duty for all the people. That doesn't stop because of this personal tragedy. You have to continue. Verse 8, And the Lord spoke to Aaron, saying, Drink no wine or strong drink, you or your sons with you, when you go into the tent of meeting, lest you die. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations. Okay, is God randomly saying this? Just random little factoid, by the way. Hey, don't drink on the job. No, do you think most likely the author's Moses is trying to show us something? The ideas are connected, what they did, and then their death, and then God saying, don't drink wine or strong drink while you're on the job. Verse 10, you are to distinguish between the holy and the common, and between the unclean and the clean. And you are to teach the people of Israel all the statutes that the Lord has spoken to them by Moses. All right, so what's going on here? So based on God revealing himself through fire in the previous chapter, and the command to not drink on the job immediately following Nadab and Abihu's death, I think an implication can be made. I'm not dogmatic about this, it's just something to think about. So trace through, we've done this, I did a sermon not too long ago called the Fiery Theophany, where we trace God revealing himself through fire. Remember to Abraham, the smoking fire pot, right? And the ox cut open in half. It's so strange, right? You're like, yeah, I don't know exactly what you're talking. Weird stuff to us. God revealed himself in that way to make a covenant with Abraham. We think of the pillar of fire or of light, right, leading the Israelites through the wilderness. And then we think of on Mount Sinai, there's smoke and fire coming out from the mountain. Or Moses, how does Moses get commissioned to deliver them? It's through a burning bush. God's fire was a holy thing. And just a chapter before, God lit this fire through this fiery revelation of himself at the altar. So one possibility is that Nadab and Abihu showed little regard for the holiness of their calling, evidenced by their probable intoxication. That's why God most likely mentioned it. And as a result, God possibly withheld his divine fire. In their impatience or arrogance, they just decided to replicate it on their own. They took matters into their own hands. Oh, we don't need God's fire. I'll just bring my own fire and do that. And also, most likely, they're intoxicated at this point. All right, even in our very hedonistic society, is it accepted to be drunk on the job? No, you get fired for that, right? If you get drunk on the job, you get fired for it. And these priests, the mediators of God's presence to the people, are drunk on the job and carelessly, I'll just bring my own fire. Is that a problem? You think? That's a gross disregard for God's holiness. So regardless of if that is the case or it's not the case, the theology, what we can learn about God and his nature behind this is that God desires presence and relationship, but his presence has to be on his terms, not on our own terms. Nadab and Abihu failed to honor God's holiness by treating it like something that wasn't special, right? It didn't matter. It wasn't sacred. That's why God says you have to distinguish between the sacred and the profane, and they failed to do that. So we can learn about God through this account of this Levitical lawlessness. But let's look at another one. Let's look at Passover problems in 2 Chronicles 30. So the context, I said this is in Chronicles, so you probably guessed this. This is during the divided kingdom. Northern tribes, 10 tribes north of them, and their kingdom was not doing well. Assyria had captured a lot of them at this point that we're going to read about, and they didn't have a single good king. Israel did not have a single king that faithfully kept covenant with God. In fact, most of them they weren't even apathetic towards God. They actively instituted idolatry and led people away from Yahweh. And then you had the southern king that also had a lot of wicked kings, especially at this time. Think about Ahab, and then just before the account we're going to read about, you had Ahaz. If you want a little picture about Ahaz, look at this. And Ahaz gathered together the vessels of the house of God and cut in pieces the vessels of the house of God. All right, isn't that so much more than just idolatry? He's actively taking the objects for worship for God and shattering them. Insane. And cut in pieces the vessels of the house of God. Not only that, he shut up the doors of the house of the Lord. And he made himself altars in every corner of Jerusalem. I think about when Jesus told the Pharisees that they shut the gates of the kingdom in people's faces. They wouldn't enter, and they won't let anyone else enter. He's like, not only am I content with you all being idolatrous, you can't worship Yahweh if you want to. I'm closing the temple. I'm closing God's house, his presence with his people. In every city of Judah, he made high places to make offerings to other gods, provoking to anger the Lord, the God of his fathers. The kingdom is a mess right now. Israel and Judah are a mess. But then there's this new king in Jerusalem, where the temple is, and his name's Hezekiah. And he's going to do things differently. In verse 3, in the first year of Hezekiah's reign, in the first month, he opened the doors of the house of the Lord and repaired them. He brought in the priests and the Levites and assembled them in the square on the east. And he said to them, "Hear me, Levites, now consecrate yourselves and consecrate the house of the Lord, the God of your fathers, and carry out the filth from the holy place." Isn't that shocking? This wasn't even a priest. Hezekiah is not a priest. He's a king. And he gathers the priests back together and he's like, hey, do your job. Do your job. You're the only ones that are authorized to be in there. Get in there, clean things up, take that filth out, and we're opening the house of the Lord once again. Just Hezekiah was awesome in a lot of ways. Flawed in a lot of ways too, but awesome in a lot of ways. Verse 1 of chapter 30, this is the main part we're going to focus on here. Hezekiah sent to all Israel and Judah and wrote letters also to Ephraim and Manasseh that they should come to the house of the Lord at Jerusalem to keep the Passover to the Lord, the God of Israel. Relationship between the northern and the southern kingdom is it's a very sordid past between the two. It's not like, hey, we're neighbors and we're friends and we're relatives and we're part of God's covenant people. And sometimes they go to war with each other. I mean, it was a mess. Their relationships were a mess. And there was a lot of animosity because the northern tribes were like, well, we're 10 tribes, you're 2 tribes, so we're going to build our own temple. We don't need to go to your temple. We have our own. But that's not what God said to do. So they call to the northern tribes. Look at what Hezekiah is doing. He's also trying to unite the tribes once again, to restore following Yahweh. And what specifically is going on? What does he want them to do? He wants them to celebrate Passover. For the king and his princes and all the assembly in Jerusalem had taken counsel to keep the Passover in the second month. They're going to keep Passover in the second month. Why? For they could not keep it at that time because the priests had not consecrated themselves in sufficient number, nor had the people assembled in Jerusalem. All right, if we understand what the Passover is, remember the Passover represented God protecting, pasaching his people from the death angel, and that through the blood of the lamb, the death angel would go over and they would be spared. Their firstborn would be spared. And so this feast was to memorialize that, to memorialize their freedom. God's leading them out of slavery and captivity. It's a very important feast. And it says in Numbers 9, verse 1, "And the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the first month of the second year after they had come out of the land of Egypt, saying, let the people of Israel keep the Passover at its appointed time." What's the command? Keep Passover in the first month. "On the 14th day of this month at twilight, you shall keep it at its appointed time. According to all its statutes and all its rules, you shall keep it." All right, so it was keeping Passover in the first month, a rule and a law. Yeah, it's repeated a lot right there. It was supposed to be a beginning of months. It was their new year. It was their new year. That's how important it was. God wanted them to understand what a big deal Passover was. But then God says something here. In verse 10, it says, "Speak to the people of Israel." They have a situation pop up. "Speak to the people of Israel, saying, if any one of you or of your descendants is unclean through touching of a dead body, or is on a long journey, he shall still keep the Passover to the Lord in the second month. On the 14th day at twilight they shall keep it. They shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs." So in other words, God gave a contingency plan. God wanted it to be on the first month. He told them to keep it on the first month. But he said, listen, if the people are unclean, the priests are unclean, then consecrate yourselves and just try it again on the second month. That way you can. So this was allowed for. God gave a contingency plan, which is pretty cool. And look at verse 5 here. So they decreed to make a proclamation throughout all Israel, from Beersheba to Dan, that the people should come and keep Passover to the Lord, the God of Israel, at Jerusalem, for they had not kept it as often as prescribed. They weren't following it like they should. So couriers went throughout all Israel and Judah with letters from the king and his princes, as the king had commanded, saying, "O people of Israel, return to the Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, that he may turn again to the remnant of you who have escaped from the hand of the kings of Assyria." So they decide. They're like, all right, we're going to do Passover in the second month, so everyone has a time to consecrate themselves. They send messengers to go to the northern tribes, saying, hey, come down to Jerusalem. We're going to celebrate Passover. So come down here, purify yourselves, and we're going to start it in the second month. Verse 10, so the couriers, and remember, it makes you unclean if you travel a long journey. So they'd have to head basically as soon as they got the message so that they could purify themselves in time for Passover. Verse 10, it says, so the couriers went from city to city through the country of Ephraim and Manasseh and as far as Zebulun, but they laughed them to scorn and mocked them, the northern tribes. However, some men of Asher, of Manasseh, and of Zebulun humbled themselves and came to Jerusalem. Oh, it's like a spiritual restoration. It's not all of Israel. It's just like a handful of Israelites were like, yeah, I haven't been doing right. I need to humble myself, let go of my pride, and go and do as the king is telling us. The hand of God was also on Judah to give them one heart to do what the king and the princes commanded by the word of the Lord. Verse 15, and they slaughtered the Passover lamb on the 14th day of the second month. So they prepped it. They get all the people there. They're doing it in the second month. And the priests and the Levites were ashamed, so that they consecrated themselves and brought burnt offerings into the house of the Lord. Then we're hit with something interesting. Verse 17, for there were many in the assembly who had not consecrated themselves. Again, remember, the second month was there for, that way, if you weren't consecrated in the first month, you'd have time to consecrate yourself and do it in the second month. Well, now the second month is here. And what have they still not done? The people of Israel, of the north, still had not consecrated themselves. Therefore, the Levites had to slaughter the Passover lamb for everyone who is not clean, to consecrate it to the Lord. Verse 18, for a majority of the people, many of them from Ephraim, Manasseh, Issachar, and Zebulun, the northern tribes, had not cleansed themselves yet they ate the Passover. Wrong. They weren't supposed to do that. Otherwise than as prescribed. Yet they ate the Passover otherwise than as prescribed. They didn't do it the way the law told them to. For Hezekiah had prayed for them, saying, may the good Lord pardon everyone who sets his heart to seek God, the Lord the God of his fathers, even though not according to the sanctuary's rules of cleanness. And the people heard Hezekiah and healed the people. The Passover was a mess. They had to celebrate it in the non-ideal month, though still permissible according to the Torah. But even once the priests had purified themselves, many of the people from the northern tribes had not, and they ate the Passover anyway. That was not allowed in Torah. It emphasizes that even in the own chapter, in this own chapter, like 2 or 3 times. So where's the fire? Where's the wrath happening right here? In doing theology, we have to hold 2 truths together: the severity and seriousness of God, and the goodness and the mercy of God. The text specifically says that the people who came to celebrate Passover, what does it say? They were uncaring hooligans who didn't care about the things of God. No, it says that these people that came from the north, they had humbled themselves, and that what were they doing, though flawed? Seeking the God of their fathers. They humbled themselves, and they were sincerely seeking God. So what's the point? 1, we must pursue obedience and seek to do all things according to the Scriptures. Leviticus 10:10, what we looked at. You are to distinguish between the holy and the common, between the unclean and the clean. And Peter writes, as obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance, but as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, since it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. We have to honor the holiness of God in our lives, in our conduct, in everything. We can't insist on our own way. We can't arbitrarily decide I'm going to bring in my own fire. But there's another aspect to this. God gives grace to the humble. When there is humility and a sincere heart turned towards God, he extends mercy even when things aren't perfect. That's what we see. They didn't do it. It says they did it otherwise than as prescribed, but they had humbled themselves and they were setting their heart to seek God. Micah 6:8. It's so simple. It's so simple and so true. He has told you, O man, what is good. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and walk like you know everything? And I'm ready to tell the world exactly how everyone should live their lives, because God and I are on our thrones, and I'm right there with them. And this is that the posture? Is that the spiritual posture we're supposed to have? No. We love goodness, we love kindness, and we walk humbly. We always recognize that God's up here, and I'm down here. And I'm flawed, and I need mercy. James 4:6 says, but he gives more grace. Therefore, it says, God opposes the proud. Does that include the proud, by the way, who are theologically right and everything? Yeah. God you can be opposed even though you're doing things right, if your posture is wrong. God opposes the proud, but gives grace to who? The humble. Those who are sincerely seeking God. None of us are perfect, but what is our posture towards God? That's one of pride, by the way. Bringing in that unauthorized fire, that's a position of pride. But even when we get things wrong, I just think about Hezekiah interceding for them, right? He prays for the people and knows this is wrong, this isn't according to the law. And he says, God pardon them. And God heard that prayer and he answered. We don't have a king. Well, no, we do have a king. King Jesus, who is also a high priest. If Hezekiah's prayer worked for broken people who got things wrong, what about God's Son, who is interceding for us right now? What kind of grace do we have if we are walking humbly with our God? It's all about posture. We have to consider what our posture is, if we're being prideful and insisting on our own way, or if we are humbly recognizing our areas of flaws, being open to being wrong, open to learning, and realizing that I am imperfect, but Jesus is perfect, and he died for me. So my question is, are you walking humbly with your God, or are you walking in pride? Are you living in rebellion to him, or have you submitted to him in baptism and in your life, in your conduct? Is he king of your life? If you have any need, we ask that you come forward as we stand to sing number 819.